It was a typical Tuesday morning, one that seemed so ordinary that no one would have suspected it would end in the way it did. The sun peeked through the classroom window, casting a warm glow over the desks. The walls were lined with posters of historical figures and inspirational quotes, but today, none of them could compete with the electrifying tension that began to unfold within the four walls of room 204. Tasha Harris sat at the back of the room, as she always did. She wasn't the loud type. In fact, she preferred to keep to herself, blending into the background. Today, like any other, she felt the usual unease settle in her chest as her classmates' voices buzzed around her. They were gossiping about the upcoming school event, a special guest speaker who was supposed to visit the school later in the week. The name had sent a wave of excitement through the halls when it was announced, the legendary action star, none other than Chuck Norris himself. Everyone, it seemed, was eager to meet him, to hear him speak, to learn from his incredible experiences. Tasha wasn't interested in the buzz. She had heard it all before. Chuck Norris was her father, after all. Not just some distant figure on a screen, he was the man who raised her. The man she had spent every day of her life with. But somehow, that fact had always been a secret. Her dad didn't want the spotlight on him. He didn't want her to be known just as Chuck Norris's daughter. And so, Tasha grew up in the shadow of a name that everyone else seemed to revere. Today, though, things were about to change. She had no idea, not even for a second, that this was the day everything would come crashing down around her. Mrs. Henderson, the history teacher, was up front, droning on about the next exam. The lesson was boring, and Tasha couldn't focus. She stared at the pencil in her hand, tracing it along the edge of her notebook. A dull hum filled the air, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of papers and a whispered conversation. And then Mrs. Henderson dropped the bombshell. "All right, class," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "Let's talk about something interesting. Tasha, why don't you tell us about your dad? I hear he's quite the celebrity." "Chuck Norris, right?" Tasha's blood froze. The words hit her like a slap across the face. It was as though the room had gone silent, even though she could hear the muffled chatter of her classmates around her. Every head in the room turned toward her, eyes wide, waiting for her response. The pressure built in her chest, threatening to suffocate her. Mrs. Henderson's voice was laced with mockery. "Your dad? Chuck Norris? Are you pulling my leg, Tasha? That's a good one." Laughter erupted from the students around her. Some of them looked at each other, wide-eyed, as if to confirm they had heard right. Others exchanged knowing glances, clearly unsure whether to laugh or just roll their eyes at another one of Tasha's supposed stories. Tasha swallowed hard. Her hands began to tremble. She hated this. She hated how everyone was laughing at her, how they didn't believe her. But the truth was, she wasn't sure how to explain it to them. How could she possibly describe her relationship with her dad to people who only saw him as a movie star? How could she make them understand that he wasn't just a screen hero to her? For years, Tasha had kept her father's identity a secret. There was a reason for it. Chuck Norris had never wanted the attention. He didn't like the idea of being in the public eye all the time. He didn't want Tasha to be defined by who her father was. And so, they had lived in the shadows, a father and daughter, far away from the limelight. But now, here she was, faced with the reality that her secret was no longer safe. The room was buzzing with whispers, and Mrs. Henderson's voice was growing louder. "Well, I've heard some wild things in my day, but that takes the cake," the teacher continued, still smiling. "Chuck Norris, huh? Is he coming to visit us next? Maybe you can get him to do some roundhouse kicks for us." The mocking tone in Mrs. Henderson's voice made Tasha's blood boil, but she held herself together. She couldn't give in to the pressure. She couldn't let them see how much it hurt. "Yes, my dad is Chuck Norris," Tasha said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The laughter didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to intensify. Some students snickered. Others straight up laughed out loud. Tasha felt her face burn, but she refused to let it show. She looked down at her desk, willing herself not to cry. She could handle this. She had to. But then Mrs. Henderson leaned against the desk with a smug smile, as if to say, "I knew it." Her voice was dripping with sarcasm. "All right, Tasha, let's have a little fun with this. Why don't you tell us what it's like to have Chuck Norris as a father? Does he teach you to do roundhouse kicks, too?" The other students giggled. Tasha's heart raced. She hated how this was unfolding. She hated how they didn't believe her. She hated how they saw her as some kind of joke. She just wanted to crawl under the desk and disappear. But before she could even respond, the classroom door creaked open. Everyone turned their heads. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room. It wasn't the sound of a teacher entering, it was the heavy, purposeful steps of someone who knew they were about to make an entrance. And that's when it happened. The door swung open, and in walked a figure that made everyone in the room stop dead in their tracks. There he was, Chuck Norris. Tasha's heart skipped a beat. She had seen him walk through doors like this many times before, but never in front of an audience like this. Never in a room full of her classmates, who had just laughed at the idea of him being her father. He stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, exuding a quiet confidence that was both intimidating and reassuring at the same time. The room fell silent. Tasha didn't know what to do. Her hands shook, and her chest tightened with anxiety. She had never imagined this moment would come like this, unexpected, unannounced, in front of all these people who had just mocked her. The class was frozen. Eyes were wide, mouths hanging open. "Chuck. Chuck Norris," one of the students gasped. "Is that, really him?" Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. She blinked, as though trying to process what was happening. Is it really you?" she stammered. Chuck Norris, as calm as ever, nodded slightly. "Yes, it's me," he said in a low, steady voice. "I'm here to see my daughter, Tasha." The room was in complete shock. No one could process what they were seeing. Was this a joke? Was someone playing a prank? But there was no mistaking it. It was him. The real Chuck Norris. Standing in the doorway. Tasha's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at her father. She had always known him as her dad, but to everyone else, he was the legendary action star. The man who had become an icon through his roles in movies and TV shows, the man who was known for his unmatchable strength and incredible feats. But to Tasha, he was more than just an image on a screen. He was the father who had been there through thick and thin. The man who had raised her, protected her, and loved her unconditionally. He was her rock. And now, in this moment, he was standing in front of her classmates, proving that everything she had said was true. The truth was undeniable. Tasha had never lied. She had never exaggerated. Her father was Chuck Norris. And as he stepped into the classroom, all the laughter and mocking stares faded away, replaced by a sense of awe, disbelief, and, for some, fear. Mrs. Henderson didn't know what to say. She stood frozen, unsure how to react. Tasha could see the shock in her eyes. It was the same shock everyone else in the room was feeling. No one knew what to do with the truth now that it was right in front of them. But this was just the beginning. What happened next would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about Tasha, her father, and the truth behind the incredible story that had been shared in whispers for years. And as Chuck Norris stepped forward, the mystery was just beginning. The silence in the room was suffocating. The moment Chuck Norris stepped inside the classroom, everything changed. For a few seconds, no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the world outside the classroom had stopped, leaving only the heavy presence of this larger-than-life figure filling the space. Chuck Norris wasn't just any man. He wasn't a figure plastered on billboards or in movies. He wasn't someone who visited the school to give a motivational speech. He was the person Tasha had grown up with, the man who had always been by her side, her father. But to everyone else in the room, he was a myth, a legend, a name spoken with reverence and awe. And there he was, standing before them all. Tasha felt a rush of emotions wash over her, relief, embarrassment, fear, but most of all, uncertainty. She had always kept her father's identity a secret, hiding the truth behind the closed doors of their home. She hadn't expected to face this moment so suddenly, and certainly not in front of an entire classroom of teenagers who had just ridiculed her. Chuck Norris didn't flinch under the weight of the stares. His eyes scanned the room with a calm, unwavering confidence that was both soothing and intimidating. He was used to the attention, but even this moment seemed to carry an air of heaviness. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Henderson, who was still frozen in place. The teacher's mouth opened and closed as if trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. "It's all right," Chuck Norris said in his deep, gravelly voice. "I know this must be a surprise for everyone. But yes, I am Tasha's father. And yes, I've come to pick her up." Tasha's heart was racing. She couldn't quite understand what was happening. She had never expected her father to show up at school like this. She hadn't even known he was in town. But there he was, and suddenly, all the whispers that had surrounded her for years, the mockery, the disbelief, seemed to vanish in an instant. Still, the students were in shock. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Chuck Norris? The man who had become a symbol of strength, power, and invincibility? The action star who had become a household name? Standing in their classroom, speaking so calmly, as though nothing was out of the ordinary? For a few moments, Tasha thought she might faint from the intensity of it all. But Chuck Norris didn't give her a chance to process. He walked further into the room, his footsteps steady and deliberate. His eyes never left Tasha as he approached her desk. "Tasha," he said softly, almost as if no one else was in the room. "It's time to go." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat was tight, and her mind was racing 100 miles an hour. This wasn't how she imagined this day would go. She never thought her father would walk into her classroom in front of everyone. She had always kept their life together private, knowing that people would never understand. But now, everything was laid bare. As Chuck reached her desk, he bent down slightly to look her in the eyes. For a brief moment, Tasha felt a sense of calm wash over her, the way only her father could make her feel when the world felt out of control. "Don't worry about them," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "This is just the beginning, and we'll handle it together." Tasha swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. It wasn't embarrassment that had her on the edge of breaking down, it was the overwhelming sense of vulnerability. For the first time in her life, she felt exposed. Chuck turned his gaze back to the room, his presence commanding attention. "I didn't mean to disrupt your day," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But this is important." Tasha's had to carry a lot of weight on her shoulders for a long time. "And I've never been one to back down from the truth." Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice. I had no idea," she stammered, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and awe. "I never thought. I never imagined." Chuck interrupted her with a polite wave of his hand. "It's okay. I don't expect anyone to believe it right away. But I hope this clears things up for Tasha. She's been a great student, and she deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who her father is." The room remained still, as if everyone were collectively holding their breath. No one knew how to respond. What do you say to the man who had become a living legend? The man whose very name was synonymous with strength, honor, and unyielding will? Tasha felt a sense of pride mixed with discomfort. It wasn't about her father's fame, it was about the fact that he was standing up for her in a way no one had before. But at the same time, she wished this moment could just be over. She didn't want to be seen as the daughter of a celebrity. She wanted to be Tasha Harris, the girl who had always been quiet, reserved, and, most importantly, normal. Chuck seemed to sense her discomfort. "Tasha, let's go," he said, turning toward the door. With one last glance at her classmates, Tasha stood up, gathering her things. As she walked toward her father, she could feel the eyes of every student on her. It wasn't the first time she had felt like a spectacle, but today, it felt different. Today, the truth was out. Today, her father's legend had entered the classroom. As they stepped out of the room, Chuck placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Tasha. You don't have to hide anymore." She nodded silently. She didn't have the words to express everything that was swirling inside her. She didn't know what to feel: anger, relief, confusion. All of it seemed to collide in a chaotic mess. They walked down the hallway, past rows of lockers, the sound of footsteps echoing against the tiled floors. Tasha didn't look back. She didn't want to see the looks on her classmates' faces. She didn't want to hear their whispers. When they reached the front doors of the school, Chuck stopped and turned to face her. "Tasha, I know this is a lot to take in. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. But I've been away for too long. I should have come to see you sooner." Tasha's heart sank at the words. She had spent so many years wishing her father could be there for her, wishing she could tell everyone the truth about who he was. But now, in this moment, she felt as though she didn't even know who she was anymore. "I'm sorry, Tasha," Chuck continued. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me the most. But I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere." Tasha bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears. It wasn't just the fact that her father had kept his distance. It was the years of isolation, the constant struggle to live up to an image she never wanted. And now, everything was changing. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you tell them who you really are?" Chuck sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. "I didn't want you to grow up with a target on your back. I didn't want you to be treated differently because of who I am. I wanted you to have a normal life, Tasha. I thought if I stayed out of the picture, you could have that. But I see now that I was wrong." Tasha stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. The truth was more complicated than she had ever imagined. But one thing was clear: her father loved her. And despite everything, he had always been there in the way he knew how. "I understand," she whispered, wiping away a tear. Chuck nodded, his eyes softening. "Let's go home, Tasha. We have a lot to talk about. And we'll do it together." As they stepped out of the school, the cool breeze of the afternoon air hit their faces. It was a fresh start. But even with the clarity of the moment, Tasha knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The truth had come crashing down. And nothing would ever be the same again. The world outside the school seemed quieter than usual as Tasha and her father walked toward the car parked by the curb. The typical sounds of traffic, the hum of voices, and the distant calls of students seemed muted, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen next. But nothing happened. The day just continued on, the normal world pressing on around them, unaware of the monumental shift that had just occurred inside that classroom. Tasha glanced over at her father, Chuck Norris. The man who had walked into her life, only to be kept in the shadows for as long as she could remember. And now, as he stood beside her, walking her to his car, everything felt out of place. The weight of what had just happened, the truth being revealed, the mocking laughter of her classmates, the disbelief from her teacher, hung heavily in the air. Chuck didn't say much as they climbed into the car, the engine humming to life as they pulled away from the school. The silence in the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the occasional hum of the tires on the road. Tasha's mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts crashing against each other. What did this mean? Where would she go from here? She had spent so long hiding the truth, and now, it was out in the open. People would never look at her the same way again. They would never see her as just Tasha, she would always be Chuck Norris's daughter. But was that such a bad thing? She couldn't even bring herself to answer her own question. After all, for years, she had tried to distance herself from her father's fame, to avoid becoming a target for the media, for the curiosity of strangers. And now, here she was, with the truth out, and the inevitable questions and stares ahead. Chuck glanced at her, his eyes softening, sensing her discomfort. Tasha, I know this is a lot to handle. I didn't plan for this to happen like it did. I didn't think you'd show up like that, Tasha murmured, looking out the window, watching the world blur by. I didn't think anyone would ever believe me. He let out a sigh, focusing on the road ahead. I never wanted to put you in that position. You should never have had to lie about who I am. But I wanted you to have your own life. I wanted you to grow up without the weight of being Chuck Norris's daughter always hanging over you. Tasha looked over at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She could see the guilt in his expression. It wasn't just a look, it was something deeper, something that went beyond simple regret. There was a sorrow in his eyes, a sadness she hadn't noticed before. She bit her lip, trying to collect her thoughts. But now, everything's changed. How am I supposed to go back to school tomorrow? To face everyone? Chuck kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. You'll face them. And you'll show them that you're more than just my daughter. You've always been more than that. Tasha felt her throat tighten, and she looked down at her hands, folding them together in her lap. I don't know if I can handle this, she whispered. I don't know if I can deal with everyone knowing. With people constantly asking me questions. With the constant attention. I've spent my whole life trying to keep everything about me private. But now I'll never be able to escape it. Chuck's voice softened, filled with an understanding that only he could convey. I know it's a lot, Tasha. But you don't have to face it alone. I'm here. And I'll help you every step of the way. Tasha turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She had always known him as a man of few words, someone who didn't need to say much to make his presence felt. But right now, his words felt like a lifeline. The car pulled up to their house, an unassuming two-story building nestled in the quiet suburbs. It was the kind of house that blended in with all the others on the street, a home for a family that just happened to have a very famous name attached to it. Chuck turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, his hands on the wheel, as though collecting his thoughts. Finally, he exhaled deeply. Tasha, this isn't just about your classmates. This is about us. About you and me. Tasha raised an eyebrow, confused. What do you mean? Chuck turned to face her, his eyes intense but gentle. You've been living in the shadow of who I am for too long. And I get it, you didn't want to be defined by my fame. But the truth is, you've got your own story. You've always had it. And that's what people need to see. They need to see who you are, not just who your father is. Tasha stared at him, unsure of what to say. For so long, she had hidden from the world, kept her father's identity a secret, and in doing so, had hidden her own identity as well. She wasn't sure she was ready to step out from behind the curtain, to face a world that had never seen her for who she really was. But then again, maybe her father was right. Maybe it was time for people to see her, not just as the daughter of a legend, but as Tasha Harris, her own person, with her own life, her own struggles, her own story. The front door creaked open as they stepped out of the car. The house was quiet, but there was a sense of finality in the air. It wasn't just the end of the school day. It was the end of the life Tasha had known. Everything had changed in the span of a few hours. Her classmates' laughter, Mrs. Henderson's mockery, the shock of Chuck Norris walking into the classroom, all of it felt surreal now, like a dream she had woken up from. Inside the house, Chuck gestured for Tasha to follow him. The living room, with its simple furniture and family photos on the walls, looked the same as it always had. But today, it felt different, almost foreign. This wasn't just her home anymore. This was the home of someone who was about to face the consequences of a hidden truth. As they sat down, Chuck looked at her again, his expression serious. "Tasha, I know this won't be easy. People will have their opinions, and there will be questions. But I need you to know something, no matter what, you've got the right to live your life on your terms." She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. Her father was a man of few words, but the words he did speak held weight. And today, they were more meaningful than ever before. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the house, Tasha sat on the porch, her mind still spinning from the events of the day. The quiet of the evening didn't bring her peace. Instead, it gave her time to reflect, to try to make sense of everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. There were several messages waiting for her, all from friends, some from her old friends who had mocked her earlier, others from new classmates who had just heard the news. But the message that caught her eye was from her best friend, Leah. "Tasha, are you okay? We've been hearing stuff all day. We didn't know. We didn't know you were related to him. Why didn't you tell us? We're here for you. Call me when you can." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. The questions, the confusion, it was only just beginning. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to face the world now that her secret had been exposed. Chuck walked out to the porch, his steps steady and measured. He glanced down at the phone in her hand and nodded. "You don't have to answer them right now, Tasha. Take your time. People will understand. But you need to focus on who you are, not on what people think of you." Tasha looked up at her father, the weight of his words sinking in. She still wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to hide anymore. She wasn't going to be defined by the past. This was her story now. The days that followed were a blur for Tasha. Every time she stepped into school, she felt like the entire world was watching her. It was as if her every move, every glance, every breath, was under the scrutinizing gaze of everyone around her. Her classmates, who had once ignored her, now watched her with fascination. Some looked at her with awe, others with jealousy, and a few with suspicion. It was as if the truth had shattered the image they had of her, and now they were trying to figure out who she really was. Tasha had expected a certain amount of attention after her father's dramatic appearance at school. What she hadn't expected was the unrelenting barrage of questions, whispers, and sideways glances. It was overwhelming. And worse, she couldn't hide from it. She'd tried to go about her days as normally as possible, keeping her head down, focusing on her classes, doing her best to ignore the stares and whispers. But every time she looked around, she was met with eyes full of questions. It was as if everyone had just found out about her life, her family, her father, and now, they wanted answers. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages. Some were from her old friends, still trying to process the revelation. Some were from curious classmates who wanted to know more about Chuck Norris, or, more specifically, about Tasha herself. Some were just rumors spreading across social media, wild speculations about her life and her father. But through it all, one thing remained constant: she felt alone. She couldn't turn to anyone for comfort, because no one seemed to truly understand what she was going through. No one knew the weight of living in the shadow of someone so famous. No one knew what it was like to feel the eyes of the world on you, even when you didn't want it. And then there was the constant guilt. The nagging feeling that she had somehow betrayed herself by keeping the secret for so long. She had protected herself from the world by hiding her father's identity. But now, with the truth out in the open, it felt as though she had lost control of her own life. She was no longer Tasha Harris. She was the daughter of Chuck Norris. And that was a title she wasn't sure she was ready for. The turning point came a few days later. Tasha was sitting in the lunchroom, surrounded by her usual group of friends, those who still stuck by her despite the chaos. But there was a palpable tension in the air. No one knew exactly how to act around her anymore. Some were distant, unsure how to handle the situation, while others tried to act like nothing had changed. But Tasha could feel the shift. Everything was different now. It was during this lunch period that a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Tasha. She looked up, surprised to see Leah standing in front of her. Leah had been her closest friend for years, and yet, it had felt like they had drifted apart since the truth had come out. Leah had always known that Tasha's father was famous, just not how famous. But now that the entire school knew the truth, Leah seemed more distant than ever. Tasha wasn't sure what to make of it. Leah's face was a mix of emotions, concern, curiosity, and something else Tasha couldn't quite place. She sat down across from her, lowering her voice so that no one else could hear. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, Leah began. And I'm not sure how to say this, but I don't think you're handling this the right way. Tasha blinked, feeling a knot form in her stomach. What do you mean? Leah sighed, looking down at her tray before meeting Tasha's eyes. You've been shutting everyone out. You're not talking to anyone. And I get it, it's a lot to take in. But you can't just hide from it. You need to face it head on. Tasha's heart thudded in her chest. She had expected sympathy from her best friend, not criticism. Leah, you don't understand. You don't know what it's like. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want to be this, Chuck Norris's daughter. I just wanted to be normal. Leah shook her head, her eyes softening. I know you didn't ask for it. But it's your reality now. And you have to face it. People look at you like you're some sort of celebrity now. You're the daughter of Chuck Norris. People are going to want to know you. They're going to want to be close to you. But you can't push them away forever. Tasha's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell Leah that she was wrong, that she didn't need anyone, that she could handle this alone. But the truth was, she couldn't. She needed to talk to someone. She needed someone to understand. Leah, I don't know how to handle this. I've spent my whole life hiding from the truth, keeping everything about my father secret. And now everyone knows. They all know who I am. They all know my father's name. And I don't know how to make it stop. Leah reached across the table, placing a hand on Tasha's. You don't have to make it stop. But you do need to face it. If you keep running from it, it's only going to get worse. You have to take control of the narrative. You have to show everyone who you really are, not just the daughter of some celebrity. Tasha's mind spun. Leah was right, in a way. She couldn't keep hiding. But that didn't make it any easier. The pressure, the expectations, it was suffocating. I don't know if I'm ready for that, Tasha admitted softly. Leah gave her a sympathetic smile. Then take it one step at a time. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just start by being yourself. Let people see who you are, not just the daughter of Chuck Norris. You're more than that, Tasha. You've always been more than that. Tasha was quiet for a long moment, processing Leah's words. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight. But maybe, just maybe, Leah was right. She couldn't keep hiding forever. Later that afternoon, Tasha arrived home, feeling drained but determined. She knew she needed to talk to her father. She needed to make sense of everything. But when she opened the door, she was greeted with an unexpected sight. Chuck was sitting in the living room, his hands folded in his lap, his expression serious. He looked up when she walked in, his eyes filled with concern. Tasha, he said quietly, I think we need to talk. Tasha stood frozen in the doorway for a moment. She had been avoiding her father's gaze ever since he'd picked her up from school that day. She had been too focused on the chaos around her to really look at him, to really listen to what he had to say. But now, standing there, she realized that maybe she had been avoiding the one person who could help her make sense of everything. I know you've been struggling, Chuck continued, his voice steady but kind. I know that things have been difficult since the truth came out. But Tasha, I need you to understand something. Tasha took a deep breath, crossing the room and sitting down beside him. What is it, Dad? Chuck looked at her, his expression softening. You've always been your own person. Don't let anyone tell you who you are. Don't let anyone define you. The truth about me doesn't change who you are. You're strong, smart, and capable. I've always believed in you. But now, it's time for you to believe in yourself. Tasha felt a lump form in her throat. I don't know if I can, Dad. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this. I feel like I'm drowning. Chuck nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. I know it's a lot to take in. But you don't have to face this alone. You've got me, and you've got people who care about you. But most importantly, you have yourself. Don't lose sight of who you are, Tasha. Tasha wiped her eyes, feeling the tears well up. It was the first time since the truth came out that she felt a sense of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. She could do this. She could face the world on her terms, not as Chuck Norris's daughter, but as Tasha Harris, the person she had always been. The next few days blurred together in a mix of confusion, anxiety, and quiet determination. Tasha had spent a lot of time at home since the day her father walked into her classroom. Chuck had been supportive, offering her space to process, but she could feel the undercurrent of worry in his every action. He didn't say much, but she could tell he was trying to figure out how best to help her, how to ease the weight she carried on her shoulders. But no matter how hard they tried to navigate the aftermath of that moment, there was no avoiding the fact that everything had changed. Tasha's phone rang constantly, calls from reporters, messages from old acquaintances, friends, and classmates, all trying to get in touch. It was overwhelming. She didn't know who to trust anymore. She didn't know who was genuinely concerned about her, and who was simply trying to get a piece of the story. And no matter how many times she turned her phone off or put it on silent, the weight of it all lingered. She couldn't escape the questions. She couldn't escape the curiosity. And it seemed that every time she stepped outside, there was a new group of people wanting to talk to her, wanting to know about her father, about what it was like growing up with Chuck Norris as a dad. But the hardest part was facing her classmates. Every time she stepped into the school, the air felt different. The silence was thicker, heavier. It was as if the entire school was holding its breath, waiting for her to crack. And yet, despite the weight of it all, the strange truth was that no one really knew what to say to her. The whispers had started to quiet down, but the curiosity hadn't faded. Instead, it had only grown. People were still watching her, still analyzing her every move. But now, instead of mockery, there was an almost reverent silence when she walked into a room. It was as though they had all seen something in her, something that made them hesitate, something that made them wonder whether they were dealing with someone they could never fully understand. It was on the third day back to school when things started to shift. She had managed to get through the morning without too many awkward conversations, but she knew it wouldn't last. As she entered the lunchroom, she felt the stares, the eyes that followed her every move, but there was one pair of eyes that stood out more than the rest. Leah. Leah had been distant the past few days. Tasha had reached out, but it had been hard to communicate, hard to bridge the gap between them. It wasn't that Leah had been unkind, but something had changed in their dynamic. The unspoken tension between them seemed to grow with each passing day. It was as though Leah wasn't sure how to treat her now that everyone knew who her father was. Tasha walked towards their usual table, the one in the far corner of the room, where they had always sat. As she approached, Leah looked up. Her face softened when she saw Tasha, but there was still that uncertainty in her eyes. "Tasha," Leah said, her voice hesitant, as if she didn't know whether to approach her with the same ease as before. "We need to talk." Tasha sat down, looking at her friend. "What's up?" Leah took a deep breath, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've been thinking about everything. And, honestly, I don't know how to say this, but I think I've been wrong. I've been kind of avoiding you. And I didn't want to be that way. But this whole thing with your dad, it's just been so overwhelming. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to treat you anymore." Tasha stared at her for a moment, surprised by Leah's honesty. She had expected judgment, or at least some level of distance. She hadn't anticipated this level of vulnerability. "I get it," Tasha replied softly. "I really do. I mean, I'm still trying to figure it all out, too. I didn't want any of this, but now it's here, and I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to make it stop." Leah nodded, her eyes sympathetic. "I can't even imagine what it's like. Having to go through all of this, with everyone staring at you, talking behind your back. It's got to be tough." Tasha took a deep breath, her chest tightening as she felt the emotions she had been holding back start to rise. "I'm not used to being in the spotlight. I didn't ask for this. But now, it's like I can't escape it. Everywhere I go, someone is asking me questions about my dad. They want to know what it's like to be around him. They want to know if I'm just like him. And I don't even know who I am anymore, let alone what they want from me." Leah's gaze softened as she reached across the table, giving Tasha's hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'm here for you, Tasha. I know I've been distant, but I don't want to be. You're still my best friend, no matter what's happening with your dad. And I know it's not easy, but you don't have to go through this alone." Tasha smiled weakly, the relief of finally talking about it settling in her chest. "Thanks, Leah. I really appreciate that." Just as Tasha was about to say more, a shadow loomed over their table. Tasha looked up and saw a familiar face, Mrs. Henderson, her history teacher, standing there, arms crossed. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Mrs. Henderson said coolly, her tone a bit sharper than usual. "But I thought I should have a word with you, Miss Harris." Tasha felt her stomach drop. Of all the people who had been awkward or uncomfortable with her since the truth had been revealed, Mrs. Henderson was one of the hardest to read. The teacher had been one of the first people to mock her after Chuck had entered the room that day, laughing like it was all a joke. But now, seeing her standing there, something felt different. Tasha tried to remain calm, though her heart was racing. "What's going on, Mrs. Henderson?" "I'm afraid I need to speak with you about your family situation," Mrs. Henderson said, her words hanging in the air. "There are some people in the school who believe you may be taking advantage of your father's fame. There are rumors floating around that you're using your connection to him to get special treatment. I thought I'd make it clear that that sort of thing will not be tolerated in this school." Tasha's face flushed. "I'm not using anything. I've never asked for any of this. I just wanted to go to school, get an education, and be left alone. I never wanted to be this, Chuck Norris's daughter." Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow, her gaze hardening. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to bring your father into the picture." Tasha felt her fists clench under the table. She opened her mouth to respond, but Leah beat her to it. "You're out of line, Mrs. Henderson," Leah said, her voice sharp. "Tasha never asked for this. She didn't ask for her dad to be who he is. So maybe it's time to stop judging her and start treating her like a normal person." Mrs. Henderson stared at Leah for a long moment, clearly taken aback. But then, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Tasha let out a shaky breath, trying to keep the tears at bay. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected the hostility, not from her teacher. But now, standing there in the lunchroom, Tasha realized something: no matter how hard she tried, she could never escape the spotlight. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't need to run anymore. Leah looked at her with a smile, her eyes filled with determination. "You've got this, Tasha. You don't need to hide." Tasha nodded, feeling a sense of strength building inside her. She didn't know how long it would take to adjust to this new life, to embrace the truth, and to figure out who she was outside of her father's shadow. But for the first time in days, she felt like she was ready to face it all. She wasn't Chuck Norris's daughter anymore. She was Tasha Harris. And she was done hiding. Tasha sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of the past week heavy on her chest. The laughter of her classmates, the whispers that followed her everywhere, and the cold stares from people who thought they knew her, it was all starting to blur together. She had tried to stay strong. She had tried to push through it. But each passing day felt like another battle she wasn't sure she was winning. The pressure was relentless. She thought it would get easier with time, but it didn't. The world had changed for her overnight, and now, everywhere she went, there were reminders of who she was, or at least who people thought she was. She hadn't gone to school the day after Mrs. Henderson's confrontation. Instead, she had stayed home, her father watching over her quietly, offering his words of wisdom without pushing too hard. He knew, just as she did, that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought within your own mind. But now, it was Friday afternoon, and Tasha knew she couldn't hide forever. It had been days since she'd spoken to anyone outside of her immediate family. Her phone had sat in the corner of her room, ignored, its buzzing only reminding her of the questions and the pressure waiting for her. It was time to go back. Time to face the world once again. Tasha stood up, wiping the exhaustion from her eyes. She glanced at the mirror, where her reflection stared back at her, tired but determined. The person she saw was someone she didn't entirely recognize. The person she had been before the truth came out seemed like a distant memory. But deep down, she knew she was still that person, she just needed to find her way back. With a deep breath, she grabbed her backpack and made her way downstairs. Chuck was sitting in the living room, watching TV. He glanced up when she entered the room, his eyes full of concern. "You sure you're ready for today?" Tasha nodded, even though a part of her wasn't sure. "I have to be. I can't keep avoiding it." Chuck stood up and walked over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a smile. "You've got this. You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for. Just take it one step at a time." Tasha offered him a small smile in return. "Thanks, Dad." When she arrived at school, the atmosphere was just as tense as she had expected. The minute she stepped into the hallway, she felt the eyes of everyone on her. Some stared openly, others whispered behind their hands, but none of it was in her control. She was the center of attention, whether she liked it or not. But what surprised her the most was the sudden shift in how people interacted with her. The attention she had been avoiding now seemed to carry a weight, more respect, less curiosity, but still there. It was almost as if they were waiting for her to say something, to give them some kind of sign that she was ready to move forward. As she made her way to her locker, she saw a familiar face. Leah. Her best friend stood just a few feet away, her eyes locking with Tasha's. Leah gave her a small smile, and for the first time in days, Tasha felt a sense of relief. Leah had been the one person who had always been there for her, even when things felt impossible. Despite the awkwardness that had crept between them, Leah was still her anchor. "Hey," Leah said, stepping closer to her. "How are you holding up?" Tasha shrugged, trying to act like it wasn't bothering her as much as it truly was. "I'm surviving. It's not easy, but I'm trying to get through it." Leah nodded, looking at Tasha with understanding in her eyes. "I can't imagine what it's like, but you're doing great. People are starting to see you differently, you know?" Tasha raised an eyebrow. How so? Leah paused for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. I think people are starting to respect you more. Before, it was like you were just another kid. But now? It's like you've earned their respect. Tasha let out a deep sigh, the weight of her situation settling heavily in her chest. Respect or pity? I'm not sure which one. Leah reached out and squeezed Tasha's hand. It's not pity, Tasha. You're handling everything better than most people would. You're strong. And even if it doesn't feel like it right now, people are starting to notice that. Tasha wanted to believe her. She really did. But the whispers, the strange looks, they still stung. The world around her felt foreign, like she was walking in a world that didn't belong to her. As the day went on, Tasha tried to focus on her classes. She buried herself in her work, trying to block out the noise of the outside world. But her mind kept drifting back to the people who had changed. The friends who had distanced themselves, the classmates who had suddenly decided to be nice to her, as if they now saw her as something different. Something unattainable. It was during fifth period, after a particularly grueling math class, that things took a turn. Tasha was heading to the restroom when she heard someone calling her name from behind. She turned around to see Brian, a popular jock who had always kept his distance from her, standing there with an unsure expression. Hey, Tasha, he said, his voice hesitant. Can I talk to you for a second? Tasha eyed him warily. Sure. What's up? Brian took a deep breath, clearly uncomfortable. Look, I know we've never really talked much, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. About how people have treated you since, you know, the whole Chuck Norris thing. Tasha's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Brian continued, his eyes darting nervously. I know I was one of the ones who didn't take you seriously before, and I didn't know what you were going through. But now I get it. You didn't ask for any of this, and I just wanted to say I respect you for handling it the way you are. Tasha stared at him, not sure what to say. Part of her wanted to lash out, to tell him that it was too little too late. But another part of her, one that had learned from her father's wisdom, reminded her that holding on to resentment only hurt herself. Thanks, I guess, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Brian gave a small nod before turning to leave, but Tasha could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. As she entered the restroom, Tasha couldn't help but reflect on the conversation. Her mind was still reeling from the fact that Brian, of all people, had come to her with an apology. It was strange to think that people were starting to realize she wasn't just the daughter of Chuck Norris. She was her own person. But even as the day wore on, Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. She was still waiting for something, some moment when everything would click, when she would finally feel like she was in control of her life again. That moment came after school. Tasha was waiting by the school's entrance, her backpack slung over one shoulder, when she saw her father's car pull into the parking lot. Chuck stepped out, his usual calm demeanor masking the concern in his eyes. He walked toward her, his steps purposeful, and when he reached her, he paused. How was today? Tasha shook her head, exhausted but determined. It was okay. People are starting to respect me, but it still feels weird. Like I'm living in a different world. Chuck studied her for a moment before speaking. You'll find your footing. But remember, Tasha, you don't have to carry all of this alone. You're stronger than you think, but it's okay to lean on those who care about you. Tasha smiled, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew her father was right. She didn't have to carry everything alone. There were people in her life who cared, and they weren't going anywhere. As they got into the car and drove home, Tasha felt something shift within her. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. She had her family. She had her friends. And most importantly, she had herself. She wasn't just Chuck Norris's daughter. She was Tasha Harris. And that was enough.